She begged the feared Duke to marry her, a stranger in a frayed cloak, kneeling on his study floor. He agreed, without a flicker of recognition in his cold eyes. What he didn't know, the desperate woman before him wasn't a stranger at all. She was the wife he'd forgotten he ever had. The fog rolled through London that November evening like something alive, swallowing gas lamps whole and leaving only their feeble halos behind. Inside a battered hansom cab, Sophie Ashcombe pressed her gloved fingers against the cold window and counted her breaths. 12 more, then 6. Then she could no longer count at all, because the wrought iron gates of Blackwood Manor rose out of the mist like the jaws of some great beast, and her heart forgot every rhythm it had ever known. "This is as far as I go, miss," the driver called down. "Won't take the horses up that drive. Folks say strange things about this house." "Strange things?" Sophie's voice came out thinner than she meant it to.
"The Duke, miss. They say he's gone queer in the head. Stares right through a man like he's made of glass. Servants leave in the night and won't say why."
The driver spat into the cobbles. 2 shillings, if you please." She paid him and stepped down into the wet street. Her boots, once fine kidskin from a Bond Street cobbler, were now scuffed at the toes from careful, deliberate scuffing. Her traveling cloak, a frayed gray wool she had purchased from a rag seller in Cheapside that very morning, hung over a gown of pale blue silk that no servant girl could ever afford. Underneath the cloak, sewn into the lining of her sleeve, was a single locket. Inside the locket was a lock of dark hair and a tiny, painted miniature of a man laughing. The man who, in less than an hour, would look at her without the slightest flicker of knowing. She walked. The gravel drive stretched on forever, lined with ancient yews that dripped fog from their black needles.
Sophie had walked this drive 100 times before. She had walked it on Christmas mornings with snow up to her ankles, and on summer evenings when the air smelled of cut grass and roses. She had walked it on her wedding day, laughing, with Thomas's arm around her waist and her mother-in-law's pearls weighing down her throat. Now she walked it as a stranger. She had to be a stranger. Dr. Aristhorpe had been very clear. "If he remembers too soon, my lady, his mind may not survive it." The great oak door of the manor was answered by Hargreaves, the butler. He had powdered her hair himself for her presentation at court 3 years ago. Tonight he looked at her as though she were a costermonger come to sell oranges. "His Grace is not receiving callers. I must see him." Sophie pitched her voice low, rougher than her own. "Please, it is a matter of life and ruin." "His Grace, then I shall sit upon this step and wail until every neighbor in the parish comes running. Is that what the Duke wishes? Scandal?" Something cracked behind Hargreaves's professional mask. Perhaps he saw something familiar in the set of her chin. He stepped aside. "The study, end of the hall. Do not touch the paintings." She had hung those paintings herself. The study door was ajar. A single candelabrum burned on the desk, throwing long shadows up the spines of books she had bought for him at an auction in Bath last spring. And there, behind the desk, was her husband. Thomas, Duke of Blackwood, was thinner than she remembered. The candlelight made hollows of his cheeks and turned his dark hair to ink. He had been beautiful once, in the warm, easy way of a man who knew himself loved. Now he was beautiful the way a sword is beautiful, all edge and no scabbard. He looked up. His eyes, the color of a winter river, passed over her face with absolutely nothing in them. Not coldness, not curiosity. Nothing. The breath left Sophie's body in a small, soundless rush. She had known it would be this way. Dr. Aristhorpe had told her precisely how it would be. She had practiced in her chamber for 3 nights running, weeping into a pillow so that she would not weep now. It did not help. Nothing helps when the man you love looks at you as though you are weather. "Your Grace." She sank to her knees on the Turkish carpet. The silk of her gown crushed beneath her, but the cloak hid the sound. "Forgive my intrusion. My name is Sophie Ashcombe. I have come to beg a favor of you. A very great favor, which only a man of your station could grant." Thomas leaned back in his chair. He laced long fingers together. Ashcombe, I do not know the name. You would not, sir. We are gentry, not peerage. My father is dead, my uncle holds my dowry, and he intends to give it to a man I will not marry, a man who— She let her voice break, and the break was real. I am ruined, sir. Debts, promises I cannot keep. By next week I shall be in the Marshalsea, or worse. Then go to your uncle's enemies. Surely he has some. He has none who would marry me. Only one man in England may stand above him, a duke. Thomas's mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile. You wish me to marry you. A marriage in name only, your grace. A quiet wife, an unremarkable wife, one who will sit at your table and embarrass you nowhere. I ask for your name and nothing more. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the soft hiss of the candles. Then Thomas began to laugh. It was a tired sound, the laugh of a man who has been pestered by his family for months to take some pale-faced heiress to wife, who has been hounded by aunts and cousins and the family solicitor about the dukedom's want of an heir. An unremarkable wife, he murmured. How perfectly, beautifully convenient. He picked up his pen. Madam, you may rise. We shall be married on Thursday. Sophie rose, and as she rose, she pressed the locket through the fabric of her sleeve, hard enough to bruise. Hold on, my love. I am coming back for you. 2 mornings later, a hired carriage deposited Sophie at the south gate of Blackwood Manor, well out of sight of the main house. She walked the gravel path through the kitchen gardens, past the espaliered pear trees and the dormant beds of mint, and slipped through the small iron door that led into the conservatory. The glass house had been her favorite place in all the world. Thomas had built it for her in their 2nd year of marriage. He had brought orchids from Kew and roses from Damascus, and a strange flowering vine from Madagascar that the gardener could not pronounce. The air inside smelled of damp earth and citrus blossom, and even in November, the place was warm as June. Dr. Aristhorpe was waiting beside the lemon trees, his black coat brushed with white pollen. He was a small man, with spectacles too large for his face, and hands so gentle that he had once delivered a foal without bruising its dam. He had attended Thomas's father, and Thomas's grandfather before that. He was the only soul outside the house who knew the truth. My lady, he bowed, you look poorly. I have slept perhaps 4 hours since Tuesday. And his grace? He signed the papers. The banns are read. Thursday next, the village vicar will marry us in the chapel on the estate. A small affair. His aunt is furious. Sophie pulled off her gloves and pressed her cold palms to her cheeks. Doctor, he looked at me as though I were a beggar at the door. Worse, as though I were nothing at all. And that is precisely what must continue, my lady. Sit, you are trembling. She sat on the low stone bench beside a fountain that had been dry since October. Dr. Aristhorpe settled beside her and folded his hands upon his knee. I must tell you again because it bears the telling. The blow his grace took on his temple when the carriage overturned outside Reading did not break the bone. The skull held. What it broke was something we cannot see and cannot mend with bandages. 5 years, my lady. 5 years gone from his memory as if a sponge had passed over a slate. He remembers his boyhood. He remembers Oxford. He remembers his father's funeral. Yes, and he remembers nothing after the autumn of 21. He does not remember meeting you at Lady Pembroke's ball. He does not remember the courtship. He does not remember the wedding, nor the cottage in Dover, nor the spaniel he gave you for your birthday. Pip is buried by the Rose Walk, Sophie whispered. He died last spring. Thomas wept for an hour. And that grief, too, is gone. A canary somewhere overhead let out a thin, mournful note. Sophie watched a single drop of water slide down the curved glass of the conservatory wall. Tell me again why I must lie to him. Dr. Aristhorpe removed his spectacles and polished them with a square of linen. Because the mind, my lady, is not a ledger. We cannot simply enter the missing sums and balance the page. I have read every paper from Edinburgh, every monograph from Vienna. When a man is forced to remember what his mind has hidden from him,
When he is shown the proof and made to confront it all at once, the result is rarely a happy reunion. The result is most often a collapse. Some never speak again. Some sit by the window and forget how to lift a cup. And if he remembers slowly, of his own accord, then he may recover, piece by piece, as a man finds his footing on a dark stair, but the pieces must come to him. They cannot be thrust upon him. He replaced his spectacles, which is why I asked you to do what you have done. Every portrait of the two of you removed, every letter, every keepsake, every small token of your years together,
Hidden away.
in the attic, behind the old nursery door, locked with the brass key my mother gave me. Good. And the staff? Hargreaves knows, Mrs. Pell in the kitchen knows. The rest believe I am a poor relation of a Devon cousin, come to make an advantageous match. They have been told to address me as my lady only after the wedding, and to speak nothing of the years before. Then we have done what can be done. The rest is yours. The rest? Sophie almost smiled. I must make him love me again, from the beginning, as a stranger. You must let him come to it, my lady. You must not push. A man cannot be made to love. He can only be given the room to discover that he already does. Dr. Eresthorpe rose. I will call upon him on Friday next, the day after the wedding, under pretense of his usual examinations. If anything alarms you before then, you are to send for me at any hour. He paused at the conservatory door. My lady, forgive an old man for asking. Will you be able to bear it, lying beside him at night while he believes you to be a stranger? Sophie looked at the lemon tree he had planted for her on her 23rd birthday. A single yellow fruit hung from its lowest branch. I bore his absence, doctor. I shall bear his nearness. Dr. Eresthorpe bowed once more and left her alone among the flowers that knew her name. The wedding had taken place on a gray Thursday, with the village vicar reading the rites in a chapel smelling of damp hymnals and beeswax. 3 weeks had passed since. Now, Sophie stood at the top of the great staircase at Almack's assembly rooms, her gloved hand resting on Thomas's sleeve, and 300 members of the ton turned to look. Her gown was ivory satin, embroidered at the hem with seed pearls that Madame Lacroix had stitched on by candlelight for 4 nights running. Her hair was dressed high, fastened with a comb of brilliants. She wore no jewels at her throat, only a single white ribbon, because the sapphires were locked in a drawer at Blackwood Manor, and she could not yet bring herself to ask for them. They are staring, Thomas said quietly. They are curious. The feared Duke has taken a wife. It is the only thing London will speak of until Christmas. The feared Duke, his mouth twisted. Is that what they call me? Among other things. Tell me the others. Not while we are descending a staircase, sir. I should hate to laugh and pitch us both down it. A flicker of something passed across his face, surprise, perhaps. He had not expected her to tease him. She had not been certain she would dare. They reached the floor. The orchestra was tuning. Lady Jersey came forward, all teeth and feathers, and offered Sophie 2 fingers to shake. My dear Duchess, how quietly you have stolen him from us. We had quite given up hope that any woman would tempt him from his books. His books are dreadfully patient rivals, my lady. I have learned to read alongside him. Lady Jersey's smile thinned. She had hoped for a country mouse, a stammering girl who would amuse the season and be devoured by it. She moved on. The musicians struck the first notes of a waltz. I do not waltz, Thomas said. You did, once, so I am told. By whom? By a footman who served at Carlton House. He says you danced with the Princess Charlotte and trod upon her slipper. It was a lie, the sort of lie Sophie had practiced on the long carriage ride from Berkshire. She had spent 3 weeks now assembling a false history of him, made of harmless rumors and second-hand tales, so that she might speak of his past without betraying that she had lived through it beside him. Thomas almost smiled. He held out his hand. Then I cannot disgrace myself worse than I already have. Come. She placed her hand in his. The shock of it nearly undid her. His palm against hers, the warm pressure of his thumb against the back of her glove, the way his other hand settled at her waist with a familiarity he did not know he possessed. 3 weeks of marriage, and they had not touched, not once, beyond the brushing of fingers at supper. He had been a courteous stranger, and she had been a careful one. Now they moved together across the polished floor, and Sophie's body remembered what her husband's mind had forgotten. The turn at the corner, the half-step before the rise, the way she leaned an inch into his shoulder so that he would know which way she meant to go. She had learned to waltz in this man's arms, in a ballroom in Vienna, on their wedding tour. Thomas faltered once, then settled. His brow drew together.
"You are very easy to lead, madam.
You are very easy to follow, sir." "No, I mean," he shook his head, "it is as though you anticipate me. Perhaps I watch your shoulders." "Perhaps you do." But his eyes had narrowed, and he held her a fraction closer for the rest of the waltz. They left the floor when the music ended, and a stout gentleman in a green coat barreled toward them with both arms outstretched. "Blackwood, by God! It has been an age! Do you recall that fortnight at Welbeck, 3 years past? The fog so thick we lost Carstairs in the heather for half a day, and you swore you'd shot a stag that turned out to be a tree stump." Thomas went still. Sophie felt it through his sleeve, the way a horse goes still before it bolts. She saw the polite mask of his face begin to crack. He did not remember Welbeck. He did not remember Carstairs. He did not remember the stag or the stump or any single hour of that fortnight, and the panic of it was rising in him like floodwater.
"My Lord Earl." Sophie released Thomas's arm and stepped half a pace forward, smiling as though she were the most delighted woman in England. "How wicked of you to tell that story in mixed company. My husband has sworn me to secrecy on the subject of the stump. I am told there was also a matter of a wager and a pair of breeches that did not survive the bog."
The Earl roared with laughter. "He told you of the breeches? Then by heaven the man does love you. He never told his own mother."
"Husbands tell wives the most extraordinary things, my lord. It is the chief inconvenience of the institution."
The Earl laughed again and drifted off, calling for brandy. Thomas was looking at her. He was looking at her as though she were a door he had not known was in the wall, and behind which there might be a room he had been searching for all his life. "Thank you," he said, very low.
"For what, Your Grace?"
"For not letting me drown." They returned to Blackwood Manor near 3 in the morning. The carriage rolled through gates that the night porter swung open without a word, and the great house received them in silence, every window dark save for one. A single lamp burned in the library, where Hargreaves had left a decanter of brandy on the side table, as he had done every night of Thomas's life. Sophie climbed the staircase, slipped out of her ivory satin and into a wrapper of dove-gray wool, and intended to go straight to bed. She got as far as her chamber door before she stopped. She would not sleep. She knew it the way she knew her own name. The waltz was still in her body. The Earl's laughter was still in her ears. The way Thomas had said, "Thank you," was lodged somewhere beneath her ribs like a splinter. She lit a single candle and went down again, in her stocking feet, the way she used to in the first year of their marriage, when she could not sleep and went looking for him. He was in the library. He sat in the leather chair by the fireplace, still in his evening clothes, his cravat undone and hanging loose about his throat. A book lay open on his knee, but he was not reading it. He was looking into the fire as though he expected it to answer a question. She nearly turned back. Then he spoke without lifting his head. "You should be asleep, madam."
"So should you, sir."
"I do not sleep well. I have not slept well for months."
"Then we are a poorly matched pair."
She came in and sat on the low stool by the hearth, drawing her wrapper close. The fire was burning low, all embers and small blue tongues.
"May I sit, or am I disturbing your reading?"
"I have not turned a page in an hour. Sit." She sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. A log shifted and sent up a small constellation of sparks.
"That Earl," Thomas said at last, "Carruthers. He had a wife once, did he not?"
"He still does. She was at the ball, the lady in puce with the unfortunate turban."
"Ah."
"You did not know him?"
It was not a question. "I do not know any of them, Sophie.
I stood in that room tonight and looked at 300 faces, and there were perhaps 30 I could put a name to. The rest were ghosts. Worse than ghosts, for ghosts at least know they are dead. He set the book aside. I am a ghost in my own life. I walk through rooms I have furnished and cannot recall buying a single chair. I read letters in my own hand and do not remember writing them. The servants address me by a title I do not feel I have earned. And tonight, in the carriage home, I realized the only person in all of London who did not look at me as though I were a stranger was you. Sophie kept her eyes on the fire. She did not trust them to anyone else.
I am glad of that, Your Grace. Thomas. Thomas, then. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Why did you do it tonight? The matter of the stump, the breeches. You had never heard the story. You could not have. And yet you stepped between me and that man as easily as if you had been doing it all your life. I saw that you were unwell. It cost me nothing to spin a small fiction. It cost you something. She looked up at him then. He was watching her with that same expression he had worn at Almack's, the look of a man who has found a door in a wall. What do you mean? I mean that since the moment you walked into this house 3 weeks ago, I have been trying to understand why I cannot stop watching you. You move about my rooms as though you have always lived in them. You pour my coffee with the exact amount of sugar I prefer, and I have never told you. You laughed this evening at a thing my mother used to say, and I have never spoken of my mother to you. He paused. I do not believe in fate, madam. I do not believe in love at first sight. I have never believed in any of the soft things the poets sell. And yet there is a pull between us that has nothing to do with 3 weeks of acquaintance. I feel it when you enter a room. I felt it tonight when we danced. I am feeling it now. And I do not know what to do with it, because I do not know you, Sophie. I do not know you at all, and still some part of me appears to. Sophie put her hand to her mouth. She would not weep. She had sworn she would not weep in front of him, but the splinter beneath her ribs was driving deeper, because the man before her was both the husband she had lost and a stranger she was learning to love a second time. And she did not know how to grieve one while reaching for the other. Perhaps, she said, very carefully, you are simply lonely, Thomas. Perhaps. Or perhaps I am a fool. He rose and left the room before she could find an answer. The Dowager Duchess of Blackwood arrived on a Monday afternoon in a traveling coach with the family arms upon the door and 4 matched bays in the traces, and she did not ride ahead. Sophie was arranging hothouse narcissi in the morning room when she heard the wheels on the gravel. She looked through the long window, saw the crest, and felt the cold wash through her in a single bright wave. Aunt Beatrice, Thomas's father's sister. 71 years old, with a spine like a poker and eyes that had once made a bishop sweat through his vestments. She had been at the wedding 3 years ago. She had given Sophie an embroidered fire screen and called her a pleasant enough creature, considering. Hargreaves appeared in the doorway, white about the mouth. The Dowager Duchess, my lady. She has gone directly to His Grace's study and will not be turned aside. She has asked that you join them at once. How did she know? The London papers, my lady. The notice of the marriage. She has driven up from Bath without stopping. Sophie set down the narcissi. She smoothed her skirts, pressed her palms once against her cheeks to lend them color, and walked to the study like a woman walking to a magistrate. Thomas stood by the window. The dowager sat in his chair behind his desk, her bombazine skirts spread about her like a black tide. She held a lorgnette in one hand and a small velvet pouch in the other. Come in, girl. Close the door. I have no wish to entertain the servants. Sophie came in. She did not close the door. Your Grace, I had not thought to have the pleasure so soon. I had not thought to give it. Sit down. I prefer to stand. Sit down. Sophie sat. The dowager raised her lorgnette and studied her as one might study a horse one suspected of being lame.
My nephew has married you in haste, in a country chapel, with no settlement read out and no member of his family present. He tells me you came to him a stranger, in debt, and begged him for his name. He tells me he agreed because he was tired of being pestered. He tells me he scarcely knows your father's Christian name.
My father's name was Edmund, ma'am. He has been dead these 11 years.
I am not interested in your father. I am interested in you. The dowager set the lorgnette down. Thomas, you will leave us.
I will not, Aunt.
Then you will stand by the window and hold your tongue. I have known this house since before you were born, and I will speak my piece in it. She turned to Sophie. Girl, I have made inquiries. There is no Ashcombe family in Devon answering to your description. There is no uncle who holds your dowry. There is no creditor in London who has ever heard your name. You are not who you say you are. Now, before God and my nephew, who are you?
And what do you want from this house? Sophie's hands were folded in her lap. She made them stay there.
Ma'am, I do not know what inquiries you have made, but
I have made the only inquiries that matter. Hold out your hand.
I beg your pardon?
Your left hand. Hold it out. Sophie hesitated, then extended it. The dowager opened the velvet pouch and tipped its contents into Sophie's palm. A brooch fell out, oval, set with sapphires of a particular dark blue, framed in seed pearls, with a small enameled bird at its center. The blackwood swallow. Given to every duchess on her wedding day for 200 years. Sophie's wedding gift. The brooch Thomas had pinned to her bodice himself in the vestry at St. George's 3 Septembers ago, his fingers trembling, his breath warm against her ear.
This brooch, the dowager said, was reported missing from the family vault 8 months ago, the vault to which only my nephew, the steward, and the head housekeeper hold keys. It surfaced last week at a pawnbroker's in Holborn, where it had been redeemed by a young woman in a grey cloak. The pawnbroker remembers her. He says she was uncommonly pretty and uncommonly nervous. The dowager's eyes did not leave Sophie's face. Explain. Sophie's throat had closed. She had pawned the brooch herself, in October, to pay Dr. Aristhorpe's fee for the consultation in Edinburgh, because she could not bear to tell the family solicitor what was wrong with her husband. She had redeemed it the moment she had funds, and she had hidden it in the attic with everything else. She had not known it was missed.
I bought it, she said.
From whom? From a jeweler in Cheapside. I cannot recall his name.
You cannot recall the name of the jeweler from whom you purchased a brooch worth £400.
It was a great while ago.
It was 8 months ago at the most, you foolish creature. Across the room, Thomas had gone very still by the window. He was staring at the brooch in Sophie's palm. His hand had risen halfway to his temple and stopped there, frozen, as though he had been about to brush away a fly and had forgotten the motion. His breath was coming short.
Thomas,
Sophie said quickly.
Thomas, look at me.
He did not look at her. He was looking at the bird. They left for Dover on the Wednesday following. Thomas had announced it at breakfast, without preamble, while the dowager was still abed and the manor was still recovering from her 3-day occupation. He wished for sea air. He wished to be away from London.
He wished to be away, Sophie understood, from anyone who might arrive with a velvet pouch and a question he could not answer.
The brooch had been surrendered to the dowager. The matter had been settled, after a fashion, by Thomas himself. He had stepped between them at the window and declared, in a voice Sophie had not heard him use since the accident, that the brooch was his to give, and he had given it to his wife, and that the steward would be questioned about his record-keeping. The dowager had departed the next morning, unconvinced, promising to return. The carriage ride to the coast took 2 days. They stopped overnight at an inn at Sittingbourne, where Thomas took a separate room, and Sophie lay awake, listening to rain on the casement, wondering whether his memory had cracked in the study, and whether he was, even now, beginning to piece the truth together without her. He had not asked her a single question about the brooch. That frightened her more than any interrogation.
The cottage at Dover sat above the chalk, half a mile from the cliff edge, a low, whitewashed thing with a slate roof and a garden grown wild. Thomas had bought it the second year of their marriage, claiming he wanted somewhere small, somewhere without footmen. Sophie had laughed and called it a fisherman's hut, and he had carried her over the threshold anyway. He did not carry her over the threshold this time. He handed her down from the carriage, gave instructions to the elderly couple who kept the place, and walked directly to the cliffs without removing his coat. Sophie went after him. The rain had begun in earnest by the time she caught him up. It came sideways off the channel, cold as needles, plastering her bonnet to her hair and turning the chalk path to white paste beneath her boots. Thomas stood at the cliff edge with his hands behind his back, watching the grey water heave below. "You will catch your death," she called. "Then I shall have died at a place I love. It is more than most men can ask." She came up beside him. He did not look at her. "Sophie." "Yes?" "There are no debts." The wind took her breath for a moment. "I have had a man in London look into your circumstances. There is no uncle. There is no creditor. There is no suit pending against you in any court in England. You have not asked me for a penny since the day we were wed. 3 weeks of marriage, and you have asked me for nothing but a chair by the fire and a place to read in the evenings." He turned to her then. The rain ran down his face like tears that were not his. "Why did you come to me, Sophie? Why did you truly come?" She had prepared 100 answers for this question. She had rehearsed them in carriages, in bedrooms, in the long hours before dawn. Every one of them deserted her now. She looked past him, out over the water, and saw the lighthouse on the South Foreland. Its lamp was lit early against the storm, a small, steady gold against the slate of the sea. "There was a sailor once," she said. "A sailor? A captain. He sailed out of a harbour I shall not name on a fair morning with a fair wind, and his wife stood on the quay and watched him go. He was meant to be home by Michaelmas. He did not come home by Michaelmas. He did not come home by Christmas. Word came in the spring that his ship had struck a reef in a fog off the African coast, and that he had taken a blow to the head, and that he had been carried ashore by his men, and that when he woke, he did not know his own name." The rain hissed against the chalk. Thomas had gone very still. "Go on." "His men nursed him. They put him on a packet bound for England. He came home in the autumn, a year and a day after he had sailed, and he walked up from the harbour to his own front door, and his wife opened it." Sophie's voice held. She did not know how. He looked at her, Thomas. He looked at her with kind, polite eyes, and he asked her if this was the house of Captain So-and-so, because he had been told his wife lived here, and he had been hoping she might help him remember her. And what did she do? She lit a fire. A fire? Every night, in the upper window that faced the sea. She told him it was for ships, but it was not for ships. It was for him. She thought, you see, that if she kept the fire burning long enough, some part of him would remember the way home. Not the house, the way to her. Thomas was looking at her now as he had looked at her in the library, as if she were a door. "Sophie," his voice was raw. "Did she ever find him? The wife? Did the captain ever come home to her?" Sophie looked at the lighthouse. The lamp turned and turned again. "I do not know yet," she said. "She is still keeping the fire." They stayed a week at Dover. The weather softened on the 3rd day, and the cliffs turned from grey to a pale, watery green where the gorse was coming into bud. Thomas walked alone in the mornings and read aloud to her in the evenings, choosing books at random from the small shelf in the parlour. And twice he reached across the supper table and covered her hand with his, and did not speak. He did not ask her again about the captain. They returned to Blackwood Manor on a Tuesday, in time for supper. Sophie went up to her chamber to change out of her travelling dress and found a small file on her writing desk with a note in Mrs. Pell's careful hand. The apothecary in the village had sent word that the Duke's tonic was ready for collection. Sophie pinned on her bonnet again and walked down through the park before the light failed. She was gone perhaps an hour and a half. Thomas, alone in the house, wandered. He had begun to do this since Dover. He moved through rooms he did not remember furnishing and tried to remember them. He picked up small objects, a paperweight, a snuff box, a silver letter opener, and waited for them to speak to him. They never did. But the pull he had spoken of in the library had grown stronger, not weaker, since the brooch had been pressed into his wife's palm. He climbed to the second floor. He climbed to the third. He had not been to the third in months. The draft caught him in the long corridor outside the old nursery, a thin, cold thread of air running along the floor, coming from a door at the end of the passage that he could not recall having seen open in his life. The door was locked. He went down to the steward's office, found a ring of household keys hanging on a peg, and came back. The third key he tried turned the lock. A staircase rose into the dark. Thomas took a lamp from the bracket on the landing and climbed. The attic was long and low, smelling of old wood and lavender and the slow dust of years. Trunks stood along one wall, hat boxes were piled in a corner. A dressmaker's form wore an old riding habit in a color that had gone out of fashion before he was born. In the center of the room, beneath a sheet of Holland, stood a stack of canvases. He lifted the sheet. The first painting was a landscape, harmless enough, a view of the lake at the back of the estate. The second was a still life with pheasants. The third he did not look at properly, for behind it, leaned against the wall, was a portrait. He drew it out. Two figures stood in a field of lavender. The sky behind them was the high, soft blue of late June. The man wore no coat, only shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his head was thrown back in laughter. The woman beside him was bending to gather a stem of the flower, and she was looking up at him as she bent, and she was laughing too, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has never in her life been afraid of the man she stands beside. The man was him. The woman was Sophie. The small brass plate at the base of the frame read, "The Duke and Duchess of Blackwood, in the lavender field at Mickleham, anno 1823. Thomas sat down. He did not choose to sit down. His knees gave way and the floor came up and met him, and he sat on the boards of his own attic with the lamp guttering beside him and the painting balanced against his thighs, and he stared at his own face laughing in the summer light of 2 years past. He did not weep. He found, in fact, that he could not even draw a full breath. Something had broken open in his chest, something that had been pressed shut for many months, and through the broken place a flood was rising that had no name. He set the painting aside and went to the nearest trunk. He opened it. Letters, bound in faded ribbon. "My dearest T," in a hand he knew at once, because it was the hand that wrote his marketing lists and his thank-you notes and the small, affectionate scribbles she left on the breakfast tray. "My darling Sophie," in his own hand, a hand he had not known he possessed for such purposes. A wedding program. St. George's, Hanover Square, the 14th of September, 1823. A pressed sprig of lavender between 2 squares of card. A small leather collar with a brass nameplate. Pip. He picked up the collar. He held it in both hands. And the flood rose to his throat, and he made a sound that was not a word, not quite weeping, the sound of a man who has been walking in the dark for a very long time and has put out his hand and touched a wall he knows. She was not a stranger. She was the half of his life he had mislaid. She was the woman who had stood on the quay and watched him sail. She had lit the fire. She had been lighting it every night of these 3 weeks in the upper window of her own face, and he had been the captain too lost in his own fog to find the harbor by its glow. Downstairs, the front door opened, and his wife came home. 3 weeks later, on a morning in early March, the bells of St. Mary's in the village began to ring. The wedding had been the dowager's idea, and Thomas had not opposed it. A second ceremony, public this time, in the parish church, to silence the whispers that had followed the hasty country rites at the chapel on the estate. The banns had been read 3 Sundays running. The villagers had turned out in their best, lining the road from the lodge gates to the lich gate, and a thin sun had broken through the clouds at 9:30, as if it had been engaged for the occasion. Sophie stood in a small paneled room at the back of the church, alone, fastening the last of the small pearl buttons at her wrist. Her gown was pale rose, not white. She had refused white. Whatever else this morning was, it was not a beginning, and she would not stand at the altar in a lie of a color. The maid had wept at the choice. The dowager had pursed her lips and said nothing, which was, from the dowager, a kind of consent. The bells stopped. Footsteps in the porch. The vicar appeared in the doorway, kind and round and smelling faintly of bay rum. "They are ready, my lady. His Grace is at the altar." "Thank you. A moment, please." He withdrew. Sophie pressed her hands flat against the wood of the dressing table until her knuckles went white. She had decided in the night. She had lain in the dark of her chamber, listening to the house breathe around her, and she had decided. She could not stand before God and the village and a vicar she had known since she was a bride of 22 and pledge herself a second time to a man who did not know she had pledged herself a first. The lie had grown too large to carry up the aisle. It had been one thing in a candle-lit study in the first desperate days when Dr. Aristhorpe's warnings were fresh and every hour was a knife edge. It was another thing entirely now, with Thomas looking at her across the breakfast table, as he had looked at her in the library and on the cliff at Dover, with that slow, gathering wonder, that pull he could not name. He deserved to know, whatever the cost. She would tell him at the altar, before the vows. She would put her mouth to his ear and tell him the truth in a single breath, and let the collapse come, if collapse must come, in the arms of the man who loved her, and not in a marriage made of paper and pretense. She walked out of the paneled room. She walked down the side aisle. She passed the font where she had been baptized as an infant in another parish, in another life, when none of this had yet been written. The church was full. The villagers in the back pews. The dowager in the family box, in dove grey, her chin high. Dr. Aristhorpe in the second row, his spectacles polished, his hands folded. Hargreaves at the end of a pew, weeping openly into a handkerchief he had owned for 40 years. And Thomas at the altar. He was in dark blue, with a white waistcoat and a single white rose in his buttonhole. He turned as she came up the aisle, and the look on his face was not the polite, careful look of a man marrying a stranger. It was the look of a man watching his wife come back to him. She reached him. The vicar smiled, raised his book, drew breath to begin. "Wait," Sophie said. The vicar's mouth closed in surprise. "A moment, Reverend. Forgive me. I must speak to my husband." A murmur ran through the pews like wind in barley. The dowager half rose. Dr. Aristhorpe's spectacles slipped down his nose. Sophie took Thomas's hands. They were warm. She had thought they would be cold. "Thomas," her voice was very low, meant only for him. "Before we say the words, there is something I must tell you. I have been carrying it so long I cannot carry it up this aisle, and I will not say a vow to you with it still on my tongue. I have lied to you. From the first night at the manor I have lied to you, and you must hear it from me, now, before God, before—" He leaned down, his mouth brushed her ear. His breath was warm against the side of her face. "You do not have to keep the fire burning anymore, Sophie." She went very still. "The captain," he murmured, "has found his way home." The church, the vicar, the villagers, the dowager, the bells of St. Mary's still settling in their tower, all of it fell away. There was only his breath against her ear and the impossible thing he had said, and the slow understanding rising in her like dawn rising over the channel. She drew back to look at him. His eyes were wet and steady. He was smiling. He was smiling the smile from the painting in the attic, the laughing summer smile of a man in shirt sleeves in a field of lavender, and it was on the face of the husband who had looked at her 3 months ago as though she were weather. The vicar cleared his throat. "Shall I begin, your graces?" "Please, Reverend," Thomas said, without looking away from his wife.
Begin. They came out of the church under a shower of dried rose petals that Mrs. Pell had been hoarding since June. Sophie walked on Thomas's arm down the gravel path, smiling at the village faces she had known for 3 years, and which had been told, for 3 months, to pretend they had not, and her smile was the smile of a woman who has not yet permitted herself to understand what has happened to her. The dowager kissed her cheek at the lich gate. Dr. Aristhorpe pressed her hand. Hargreaves bowed and could not speak. The carriage was waiting. Thomas handed her up, climbed in after her, drew the door shut, and rapped on the roof. The horses started forward. For perhaps a quarter of a mile, neither of them spoke. The hedgerows slid past the window. Sophie looked at her gloved hands in her lap and could not lift her eyes. "How long?" she said at last. 3 days. 3 days from when? From the night you came to my study in the fog. She closed her eyes. I remembered you the morning after our first supper together, Thomas said. I woke in my chamber and I knew your name before I knew my own. I knew the lavender field. I knew Pip. I knew the wedding tour in Vienna and the cottage at Dover and the inscription inside your wedding ring, which is Omnia Vincit in your hand, because you had it engraved. I knew every hour of the 5 years that the surgeons in London told me I had lost forever. 3 days. Her voice was small. 3 days, Thomas. And you said nothing. I said nothing. For 3 months you said nothing. You let me come down to breakfast every morning and lie to you. You let me sit beside you at supper and lie to you. You let me stand at the altar this morning ready to confess and lose you when you had known all along. Yes. She opened her eyes. He was watching her, and his face was not the face of a man who had played a trick. It was grave and uncertain, the face of a man who has done a thing he is not sure can be forgiven, and who is asking, without words, to be told. "Why?" she whispered. He took her hands. He turned them over in his, and looked at the small pale callus on the side of her right forefinger, where her pen rubbed when she wrote her morning letters. Sophie, before the accident, we had been married 2 years and 4 months. Do you remember what we were like in September last, before I went down to Reading? We were... She stopped. She had not let herself think of it. We were quiet. We were polite. We were busy. You had the estate, I had the orphanage at Greenwich. We dined alone perhaps twice a week. We slept in separate chambers. We had done since Easter. I cannot remember the quarrel that began it. Can you? No. Nor can I. Some small, foolish thing about a dinner invitation, I think, and then a week of separate chambers, and then a month, and then it was simply how we lived. We were a duke and a duchess. We were no longer 2 people who had laughed in a field of lavender. His thumb moved over her knuckles. I loved you still. I want you to understand that. I loved you every day of those months, but I had forgotten how to show you, and you had forgotten how to ask, and we were becoming, by slow inches, the marriage my parents had, which was no marriage at all. Thomas. On the 3rd morning after you came to me in the fog, I sat up in my bed and remembered all of it. The 5 years, the wedding, the cottage, the quarrel, the separate chambers, the cold, polite breakfast on the morning I left for Reading, where neither of us spoke above 6 words. His voice was steady, but only just. And I remembered you the night before, in the study, kneeling on the carpet in a cloak you had bought from a rag seller, begging a stranger to marry you. Begging. To save my mind, to save me from a collapse I never had. You had hidden every portrait. You had emptied the walls of our life so that I might find them again in my own time. I would have done more. I know. That is why I said nothing. She was crying now, not loudly. The tears were simply running down, and she was not lifting a hand to stop them. Sophie, I had spent 2 years forgetting to court my own wife, and then I woke one morning and found that my wife was courting me. From the beginning, from the first hand on the staircase, from the waltz at Almack's, from the lie about the breeches and the Earl. You were lighting the fire every night, my darling, and I... His voice broke at last. I could not bring myself to put it out by speaking too soon. You let me suffer,
I let you love me. I let myself be loved as I had not been loved since the lavender field. And every day I meant to tell you, and every day I was a coward. And at last I knew I could only tell you at the altar, because anywhere else you would have left the room before I finished. She looked at him, her husband, the captain, the man at the cliff. "You absolute wretch," she said, and put her wet face against his shoulder, and began, very quietly, to laugh. He held her, and the carriage rolled on toward Blackwood Manor, and through the small oval window the early March sun caught the brass fittings and threw a single bright coin of light onto the seat between them, like a thing returned.